Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So I want to start us off with a question, and a couple of things I want to preface it with. The first is you have to answer truthfully because we're in church and most of us will be partaking in communion. And the second is you could choose not to answer, but of course, what fun would that be? So the question, how many of us have had an experience with road rage? By show of hands. Whether you've been a victim of road rage, or maybe some of us, a couple of us, might have been the instigators of road rage. We've all experienced it. We've had our moments. You know, somebody's honking at us, somebody cuts us off, the millisecond where the light turns green and somebody honks the horn and you're like, I want to share an experience that I had, if you'll allow me. It was Holy Week. It was Wednesday to be exact. It was 2 years ago. And I was running a little bit late to church. So I may have, this isn't an admission of guilt, by the way, but I may have been speeding just a little bit. And I start getting into the neighborhood over here, and there's a vehicle in front of me that's driving a little bit slow, and maybe about 10 seconds where I got stuck behind this vehicle, and I saw my opening, and I decided to just go around as quickly as possible. May have, kind of cut off the person. And I figure, okay, I'm clear. And, you'd look in the rearview mirror every once in a while, and I did, and I realized it was one of our parishioners. Oops. Yep, oops, exactly. So now I'm stuck with a dilemma. So I started going, and it happened that year that there was an intersection that was being constructed, and you could either take the detour to go around, or you can go around this strip mall that's to the left. And I was accustomed for the first couple of days going around the strip mall because, it's a free country. You could do whatever you want. So I did that. But this time around, I went behind the strip mall thinking I could lose this person and they won't see me and I can get to church a little bit sooner than them. So I go around the strip mall, and as I'm going around, I see this person now coming at me vicious look in the eyes, ready to take me out in this whole thing. So I decide to do the right thing and hit the brakes. Person goes ahead and just continues. So I'm continuing down on the way to church, and now there's a yellowish light. I figure let me go through it, betting on the fact that this person would stop, and indeed this person stopped. So I continued going, get to church, and I think in one split move, this is where all the marathon training comes into play. I jump out of the car, kick off my shoes, get into the church, turn on the screens, get the iPad going, and I'm ready for everything to get started, and I'm sitting here as if I've been sitting for a good hour, holding my breath at this point because I didn't want the person to see me panting. And this person comes into church. It wasn't Abuna, by the way, just so that we can clear that out. So there's a point to why I'm sharing this story, and I'll get to that point, but I think it's important that we go through today's reading first so that the point becomes a little bit more clear. So today's reading in particular wasn't just revolutionary for its time, but it's remarkably applicable today. And it's something that I and some of us tend to struggle with, even though we know better. Looking at today's gospel more closely, these weren't just concepts that Christ was describing, but these were instructions for each and every person that was on the mount and for each one of us. He told those that were in attendance, that were conditioned on ancient laws of vengeance and restitution, not just to love your enemies, which was mind-blowing on its own, but to do good to your enemies. It was a way for us to put love into action. If you're slapped, turn the other cheek. If something is being stolen from you, give more than what was already taken. And there's a lot to consider with this, but I want to take a step back. So question, was Christ undoing what was being taught in the Old Testament? Was everything from this moment about to change? The answers are no and yes. And I don't like to come up with these answers on my own, so I turned to the fathers, and St. Ephraim provided an explanation for this passage. He said that the law or the commandments were meant to perfect things. And it's not perfect like God perfect, but to perfect things, to restore things, to bring things back to to their original state as much as possible. But now Christ, who himself was the fulfillment of the law, became the ultimate restorer. He took on every ounce of punishment He took on death, and he did it all through humility. He was the one that was slapped. He was the one that was stolen from. He was the one that suffered for all of humanity as an ultimate expression of love. And this was the grace that he showed to each and every one of us. And he did this in order to prepare us with instructions to learn, experience, and most importantly, to express that same love and grace to one another. And if you think about this for a second, how can we not turn the other cheek if he gave his face to be spat on? How can we be so connected to the material world when God the Father gave his only Son for the entire world? This was being taught to the disciples. This was being taught to the apostles. This was being taught to everybody that was on the mountain with him that day, and those that would continue to follow his teachings in his footsteps. And these very teachings would end up becoming the prototype for and to establish the church that we're in today. And it's nice that we read this during our journey through the Apostles' Fast, where they're out laboring to establish the church for us. To give us an idea of just how impactful today's reading is, I want to share with you a letter that was shared with me years ago, and it's approximated to be dated back to 130 AD. I butcher the name of the letter itself, so I'm not going to share it now, but Abuna, if it sounds familiar. The author writes, "Christians love all men, but men persecute them. They live in poverty, but enrich many. They are totally destitute, but possess an abundance of everything. They suffer dishonor, but that is their glory. A blessing is the answer to abuse. Deference their response to insult. For the good they do, they receive the punishment of malefactors, but even then they rejoice, as though receiving the gift of life." And it goes on to read, and this is really, this hits home for me. Christians, although subjected to punishment on a daily basis, and he's talking now about the Roman Empire, what was happening to them. Christians, although subjected to punishment on a daily basis, keep increasing in number. My brethren, this alone shows the effect of turning the other cheek and giving more than what is taken. Now, there's some additional things with the substance of this, of what's being taught. Is Christ asking us that, is he telling us that it's okay to be bullied? Is he talking about foreign policy and war? Is he talking about being victims of crime? Absolutely not. Because he does instruct us that there is a time and place, there are moments where we should be speaking the truth. And there are moments where the church and we as parishioners have stood up for the truth. Christ himself in John 18:23, after being struck in the face, asked why he was struck if he was speaking the truth. And there are moments that we're being called on to do the same. But this is a little different here. Today's message is a bit different. Today is about grace and salvation, personal grace and salvation, because he himself is grace and salvation. And we're all in situations where we say, such and such was a slap in the face. Or if you've been in the unfortunate situation where you've actually been physically slapped in the face, you know what that feels like. But imagine the turn of events if we take revenge. If we act back out on the person. The amount of anger and resentment that would continue to intoxicate us. The broken relationships, possibly forever. And the brokenness that we would suffer, as well as the person that we'd retaliate against. And there's another part to this. This thing just keeps building. This reading continues to keep building, and there's more than what could be said today. Think about the person that's doing the slapping. What kind of profound effect it has on that person when you turn the other cheek back to them? What effect it has on that person when they've stolen something, they've stolen a coat from you, and you give them your shoes as well, because you don't want them to be cold. St. Ambrose tells us that this was Christ's approach. Those that spat on him, that slapped him, that persecuted him, and that tortured him, his response to them was, "Father, forgive them." St. Stephen, as he was being stoned to death in Saul's presence, his response was, "Father, forgive them." And that reminds me, when I was a child, and some of you back in the St. Mary East Brunswick days may have been taught this as well. We were told that when somebody messes with you and starts annoying you, whatever, your response to them should be, Father, forgive them, or God, forgive you. And we started using this as a weapon. Every time somebody would step out to me, I'd be like, God, forgive you. And it was just like this weapon. And if I was on the receiving end, I'd be like, oh no, I can't believe you just said that. I can't respond back now. I'm stuck with that. But it transformed us in some way. It got us to think about God as opposed to retaliation. The provoker ends up having an opportunity to be transformed. And we ourselves, in the act of forgiveness, in the act of turning the other cheek, in the act of giving what was freely given to us, are also transformed. In Proverbs 21, we read, he covets greedily all day long, but the righteous gives and does not spare. And this reading tells us that we should be giving of our hearts, giving of our possessions, giving of our every being to those around us, and not just to those that love us, not just to those that would repay us, but our enemies. To take it a step further, this changed the world. This changed the world. Where would Christianity be if we operated on doctrines and instructions of retaliation and revenge? But that's not the case here. Instead, we're being taught to experience grace, to appreciate grace, and most importantly, to express grace. And St. Paul reminds us that this grace is freely given to each and every one of us, not by our works, but by God's love to us. What we're being instructed to do here, what's at the core of all of this, is to love others the way that God loves each and every one of us. Rather than taking matters into our own hands, condemning one another, taking revenge on one another, or holding back grace from one another, especially at times when things are so divided, we're being told to love one another. And for those of you that were able to attend last week's prostration prayers, one thing that hit me was that the first reading during the first prostration was 1 Corinthians 13, which is a whole discussion about love. And St. Paul tells us that amongst faith, hope, and love, the greatest is love, to show us just how important this all is. So here, my brethren, we're being taught that by turning the other cheek, we're expressing love. By doing good to our enemies, we're expressing that same love. So that brings us back to the beginning. We're back to Wednesday morning, 2 years ago. I'm sitting in the church and the person comes in, and we start with the first doxology, and we start with Thoktatigom, and all of a sudden my heart is saying, how dare you just stand here and not say a word? And the person was standing right behind me. So I turned around to Uncle Ramiz and I said, Uncle Ramiz, I am so sorry for cutting you off, and please forgive me. And he just got this big smile in his face, and in English he said, that was you? In Arabic he said, Enta al-Volvo? And I turned around and I said, yes, that was me. And he said, don't worry about it. And he just gave me the biggest hug, and he had the biggest smile. And I couldn't help but think of this story when I thought about today's sermon, because in this moment, he turned the other cheek. Glory be to God forever. Amen.